Seats. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lynn Smith, and I am the chair on the House Natural Resource and Environment Committee. I want to welcome everybody here, and I will now turn the mic to my counterpart in the Senate.
Thank you, Chairman.
All right, so normally what we do in the beginning is a little bit of housekeeping. So we're together going to try and recognize our staff and people who makes this possible. So Jeremy Airy is our legislative counsel, and raise your hand. He is leaving us on Friday. So Laurie Brill is our new legislative council member. Nicole Chappelle is in the back. And then Betty Connor is in the first row with the folder right there. And let's see if I've left any. Where's Trey? Trey is right there, Trey Bennett. So these are the people who do all the logistics, pull everything together, and actually make this meeting possible. So wanted to be sure and give them a nod in the very beginning. Now what we'll do, and if y'all are new to this process, look in front of your microphone and you'll see a number that's back behind it. And I'll start with Representative Astration, but if you'll do this, introduce yourself, tell the people your role, and so we're doing this as much for people who are going to be watching this later for archiving purposes. Thank you. Let's see, your number is? 29, okay?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My name's Chuck Astration. I'm a state representative from District 104. That's Decula, northern eastern Gwinnett County. Very excited to be a part of the study committee working on this in the off-season, critically important issue. Appreciate the great interest that we clearly have today for this important issue area with a great turnout here. Look forward to hearing from the witnesses and hearing any proposals that we might have. Thank you.
Number 28.
Good morning. I'm Scott Holcomb. I'm a state representative, member of the committee. I represent District 81, which is primarily DeKalb County and a little bit of Gwinnett County. Thanks.
Thank you. Number 25. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rick Dunn. I'm director of the Environmental Protection Division.
He doesn't need to say anything else because we all want to know him. So anyway, that that says it all. So Mr. Reheis, you're number 24. Okay.
Harold Reheis. I'm with Joe Tanner and Associates. We're a government affairs consulting firm. I've had 32 years of experience in EPD back in the old days and been in private sector consulting for the last 14 years.
Thank you. And number, well, you know the three of us, so we go to you, Mike. Give me your number. 3.
I'm Mike Worley. I'm President and CEO of the Georgia Wildlife Federation. Really interested in working with all of us here on the on this stream buffer issue. Thank you.
Dr. Green?
I'm Dale Green. I'm the Dean of the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia.
Thank you, and thank everyone for being here today. Forget them, no. He's actually my constituent, so number 9, right, Tom?
Tom Crimes, president of Tomco Construction. We are a builder developer out of the Noonan Coweta area.
Thank you, and number 10?
I'm Brandon Smith. I work with Hodges, Harbor, New Bay, and Tribble. We're consulting engineers. I specialize in Clean Water Act permitting.
Thank you, and I think we've covered a large part of the issues that we'll be doing with the people with knowledge on this committee. So I'm really pleased, and I know the senator is too, that y'all are here and willing to do this. I feel it's important to point out to everyone at different times that in the state of Georgia, your legislators are what's called citizen legislators, and that means that we serve in our Constitution 40 days starting the second Monday in January. After that, we supposedly go back to our life, our careers, our jobs, or find another job because we kind of didn't have that job to start with. So it takes its toll on you citizen legislators. We are not the experts. The wisdom of our founding fathers was that it takes a collective knowledge of the body to succeed. So we're a representative legislature, and those of you in the audience and those up here in the front help make this possible. So we have been great representative government for several centuries. So thank you. And Senator, back to you.
I guess we'll go ahead and get started through the program. One of the things that the best news is we got Jack Cap said they going to hit us off. Said they Jack runs the water branch for EPD, and one of the things that today we want to kind of get a history lesson of how we got to where we are, and as we work through our committee, where we want to go in 2 important issues, and that's protecting our natural resources, but also protecting the citizens and what's going on with property rights, values on how do we assess when we do taking buffers, or how do we deal with a lot of issues. So if I can, Jack.
Thank you very much. Senator, again, I'm very pleased. Check. Good morning. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here this morning. Did we get the slides loaded in advance, and that's okay if we didn't? I've got them. Can you pardon me for a moment and get this? I need to take one of these out. Oh, is there another one?
I will pick on Representative Gazaway, who's in the audience back there. He asked me, he says, why in the world is the Revenue Commissioner coming to a Natural Resources committee? And I said, well, it all deals with money. And I'm glad to have Commissioner Lynn Riley that'll be on our program later. But we deal with a lot of issues down here, and probably one of the more important ones is the what we're doing with people's money.
My pleasure to be here today. I'm hoping to accomplish 3 quick things with my presentation this morning. The first thing is just to affirm the fact that buffers are valuable in protecting natural resources. The second thing I'm hoping to accomplish is to give you a very succinct overview of what EPD does in terms of regulating buffers, the way we determine state waters, and the way we assess rested vegetation. And then the final thing I'm hoping to accomplish today is to give you a few key points or lessons learned from a Supreme Court case a few years ago called the Tired Creek case. So with that, I'll get into my slides. And so the first thing I mentioned already is that buffers are very valuable for the purpose of protecting our land and our water resources. And here's just a simple list of the many benefits that buffers provide us. Protects water quality by filtering pollutants, stabilizes soil to prevent erosion, provides important habitat for wildlife, maintains stream banks to protect downstream properties, provides flood protection, and provides shade to moderate water temperatures. So there's a number of very important benefits that we get from having these buffers. With that, I'll move into sort of what EPD's role is here as it relates to the Erosion and Sedimentation Act. And what I have on this slide is the 3 paragraphs from the Erosion and Sedimentation Act where the buffers are listed. And so you'll note there that they are in paragraphs, in that section, paragraphs 15, 16, and 17. It's worth noting that paragraphs 1 through 14 are other things that the Erosion and Sedimentation Act requires people to do that are doing land disturbing in order to protect the environment. So buffers certainly are an important piece of environmental protection. They're not the only piece of environmental protection in the Erosion and Sedimentation Act, and so paragraphs 1 through 14 enumerate those. But getting into paragraphs 15, 16, and 17, they're slightly different for slightly different reasons. And so I've underlined in paragraph 15 that there's a 25-foot buffer measured horizontally from the point where vegetation has been rested by normal stream flow or wave action. And as I understand the sort of the discussion that we've been having across the state on this issue, is that this is really the paragraph, the buffer paragraph that's largely at issue. The paragraph 16 is a 50-foot buffer for trout streams. Trout streams are naturally cold water streams, predominantly in the North Georgia mountains, the issues of where rested vegetation is and where the buffer is largely much more straightforward in that part of the state. Where we tend to get a little more challenges in the warmer water streams further south, where there's a 25-foot buffer. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. And then paragraph 17 is a provision that the legislature added in 2015 to make very clear that our salt marsh has a buffer on it. The measurement methodology is slightly different as it was written into statute. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail on salt marsh buffers because, again, I'm thinking that's not largely the purpose of the discussion that we're having, but happy to answer any questions if we need to. EPD has measured buffers from the point of rested vegetation for many years. The particular language of rested vegetation was added to the statute in 1994. Prior to that point, buffers were measured from the stream banks. And I think that wording is relevant to sort of what happened when the statute was changed. Obviously, when you see the term stream bank in a statute, that denotes a certain thing in your head that we're talking about streams. And so naturally, when the language was changed to rested vegetation, it provided a much more, I think, scientifically specific point from which to measure where the buffer began. That bank is a little bit harder to define from an exact location, and rested vegetation was a more specific point. But largely, we're talking about streams. And then there is the definition there of rested vegetation. So it's vegetation that's been torn away due to moving water, essentially. EPD has historically taken the position that in order for there to be a protected buffer under the statute, there must be rested vegetation. And so, it's a fairly simple analysis for us. If there's no rested vegetation, there's no point to begin the measurement of the buffer. As I said, EPD has taken that position for many years. That position was clearly enumerated in a memo in 2004 Certainly our position on that preceded that memo, but that memo really documented. It was a memo that was written to local issuing authorities to give them guidance on how to implement the buffer provisions. And I included with the slides that we handed out for you this morning, I did include a copy of that memo in case you want to see it. It's a 2.5-page memo. It's not long. It's not particularly complicated. There has to be rested vegetation in order for there to be a buffer. The other thing I handed out to you is a field guide for determining the presence of state waters that require a buffer. It's a very simple fold-out brochure, and so it is the guidance that we use to determine if there's a buffer or not. You do not have to have any sort of particular degree or certification program to be able to do this. It does take some practical knowledge of the environment, but that's something that really any smart person can get with a little bit of on-the-job training by a colleague. So, I mean, it does take a little bit more than somebody walking off the street to make these kind of assessments, but really just a few weeks of on-the-job training, and any reasonable person can successfully implement that guidance. Georgia has an abundance of water resources in our state, and so we're very blessed in that regard. And so I just wanted to summarize that very quickly for the purposes of having this buffer discussion. When we talk about state waters, we have an abundance of them, and so those are the types and the sizes of state waters where this could potentially be an issue. In the majority of cases, intermittent streams, perennial streams, open waters all have evidence of rested vegetation and therefore require a buffer. Out of the guidance document that you've got, we do list a number of situations where typically there's not a buffer due to a lack of rested vegetation, and you can see those there. I've put a little star by freshwater wetlands. Freshwater wetlands typically do not have rested vegetation, and therefore we do not impose a buffer on them. And that we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. But those are just other examples of where, for a variety of reasons, there is not rested vegetation, and therefore we do not impose a buffer on those types of things. An important point to be made.
One interruption here, just a second. Number 21, Chairman Gann.
Yeah, on number 6, I was kind of curious. Can you give me an example of an impoundment with a completely vegetated bank? Is that a golf course with a pond that's got greens around it?
Yeah, you could have stormwater retention where it's completely vegetated, but something where it's completely vegetated. So where you transition from the bank into below water level, it's vegetated. So that's really what that's intended to be.
So there's no buffer at all, or typical golf course. When you look at a pond on a golf course, is there a buffer or not a buffer? That's what I'm trying to get clear in my mind.
If you've got state water, it would need to have a buffer.
Okay, so I'm trying to, in my mind, I'm seeing okay. What is this case? Have you got an example of one that you can, because I don't know of any place that this would exist. And maybe you come back to me after we get out of here.
Yeah. So. I mean, well, it can exist. I mean, you would have a situation where you've got something that holds water, probably not 365 days a year, but it holds water a certain amount of time. It can collect runoff. And because there isn't adequate movement of water over an extended period of time, that the bottom of that retention area retains vegetation, and therefore there isn't rested vegetation. So
Okay.
I'm not saying that's a common occurrence. I'm just saying that can occur, and if it does occur, there's not a buffer because there's no rested vegetation.
Thank you.
Point of this slide is that while EPD plays a very important role in terms of implementing the buffer provisions, local issuing authorities, which are cities, municipalities, have the ability to get approval from EPD to make determinations of buffer requirements. That commonly occurs, so we've got many jurisdictions across the state that are local issuing authorities. EPD maintains a list of these on our webpage. And so if that is the case, the determination of state waters and the determination of whether or not there is a buffer is made by the local issuing authority, and it is not made by EPD. EPD provides guidance to local issuing authorities to ensure consistency. We're always there to provide support and assistance if they request it. But the point here is that many buffer determinations are made by local issuing authorities, and they are not made by EPD.
May I ask you to clarify there? One of the things you run into as legislators is that at the federal level and state level, it's very clear where the buffers are, but that determination is also up to a local issuing authority, meaning they can add more to that buffer without limitations from the state. Is that correct?
Yeah, through local ordinance, they could be more stringent than the Erosion and Sedimentation Act.
So if you have a meandering stream with 25 feet on either side and it goes up and down like a zigzaggy action, you can pretty much buffer it out of use as property, correct? If the local government can add 25 or 50 on either side, and you're talking 100 feet on either side, and that's just one of the examples I think that the committee needs to also think about as we debate buffers and when do we go too far with that? So
well, yeah, I mean, your point is well taken. That in terms of the local government having some direction over the way their community is developed, they have the ability to have different requirements as it pertains to development, and the imposition of a buffer would be one of those issues.
And then essentially there also is a statute that goes to ad valorem taxes. We'll be hearing from the Department of Revenue later, but it's come to my attention and several others that even though the property is limited, there is no consideration of that limitation in the ad valorem category. So thank you.
All right.
And one more question. So do you need some water?
I'm good. I hope it appears that I'm doing well. I am.
You are. You're doing real
All
well.
right.
So the
All right.
for me, I hope that our committee members, if you've got a question that comes up, we're here to try to get resolution to issues. One of the things that I spent about 20 years in local government, and anytime you have a zoning matter that comes up, you've got a Zoning Procedures Act that you've got to follow in order to implement that. Do you know if that same procedure is done in these local governments that are local issuing authorities when they extend buffers beyond the state minimum? Do you know how they're addressing those?
No.
So you could foreseeably see a constitutional question on a taking when I think is what Chairman Smith has kind of addressed is that if we extend the buffer to 100 feet due to a local issuing authority, then you can have a taking of somebody's personal property rights.
And to our committee, so if you have a question, we can wait to the end and go back through the presentation if we need to, or if you have a question now, what you need to do is press your button so we'll know that you have a question. And if we're not clear about something, please let us know, because this is your committee. So thank you. Back to you.
So then the final just point to make on this slide is that regardless of whether or not there's a local issuing authority, if someone is going to intrude upon the buffer through land disturbance, through the 25-foot buffer. They do have to go through the variance program that EPD implements. So EPD runs the variance program that is established under the Erosion and Sedimentation Act. We do approximately 150 or so variances a year for folks. The Erosion and Sedimentation Act requires that if people do need to intrude upon the buffer, that they do take steps to mitigate that impact. So they can't just go in there and mess things up and then walk away. So part of their project in going into the buffer involves taking best management practices or other steps to minimize the impact that they're having.
Question from your boss.
Jack, can you clarify who grants the variance for what type of projects and under what conditions?
Well, yeah, so I mean, if I'm understanding the point that you're making, so EPD, the director of EPD grants the variances. And the requirement of the Erosion and Sedimentation Act is that that variance be at least as protective as what the conditions were prior to the land disturbance.
I think I was getting at there's a very limited set of projects that are eligible for the variance, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the statute and the rules do provide for what can and cannot be put in the buffer. And generally it's structured to be things that you might need as opposed to things that could reasonably be located outside of the buffer. So if there's something that could be reasonably located outside the buffer, like a home, for instance, we would expect that to be located outside the buffer. But what we find is that the buffer provisions provide for allowances for most of the type of things that you would need to put in the buffer. So.
Thank you. Another question? Okay.
I see Josh in the back of the room with the Georgia Department of Transportation, and one of the things that always interesting for me is, if you live north of the Nat line, said one of the things that if we've got a project in a county that has the local issuing authority and they've extended a buffer to 100 feet per se, and there's a alteration in the design of a road and the road's going to be within that 100 feet, who has jurisdiction on the width of the buffer in that case? Does the state concede to the local issuing authority that 100 foot because they decided they wanted 100 foot, and now anything that goes on, how is that actually put into action for a state project where we've got state funds going into a highway project or anything similar to that?
Well, I can really only speak to the role that EPD has, and so it's a little bit challenging for me to speak on the other aspects of it. But from the EPD side of things, it's very simple for me. That EPD is an agency that's created by the legislature, and so the authority that we have to regulate comes from the statutes that the legislature passes. And so the Erosion and Sedimentation Act has a 25-foot buffer that EPD oversees. We're the agency that is responsible for implementing that provision of the Erosion and Sedimentation Act. So our purview ends at 25 feet. So if there's some sort of additional agency that has some sort of jurisdiction outside of 25 feet, that's not EPD. Does that answer your question?
I guess what I'm asking is where you're allowing local issuing authorities to extend, maybe 100 feet and...
No, EPD's not allowing that. That's my point.
Okay.
Is that EPD's authority ends at 25 feet. So we authorize local issuing authorities to make that determination for purposes of the Erosion and Sedimentation Act. If they're extending it under their own authority, then that's outside of EPD's jurisdiction.
Okay. We may pick on Josh in a future study committee meeting to give us a little testimony on how the state and these local issuing authorities get along.
Okay.
We have two more questions, and I was given a prompt by analyst here, and so we've got two more presentations after this. So maybe what we'll do is go to the end of each presentation and then ask our questions. But we want to get these two right now. Number 3, Mike, state your name and.
Oh, yeah, Mike Worley. Jack, thanks for the presentations. Very enlightening here. Did want to clarify one point or ask for a point of clarification. So you say there is, for a private landowner that is dealing with these buffers on their property, there is a process for them if they need to build a dock or a whatever. There's a process for them to do that. They simply just, they apply for a variance process to protect the stream when they're building it. Do I understand that correctly?
You're exactly right. So
Okay.
EPD has, the statute directed EPD to administer a variance program.
Gotcha.
EPD does that. We have rules that implement them. We do about 150 or so variances a year.
Okay.
They all go through public notice and comment. Our review time tends to be 60 to 90 days, so it's pretty timely. We engage quite a bit with the developer to help them out and make sure they're doing what they need to do in order to protect the environment. But yes, things like any type of construction project that needs to go in that into the buffer area, we administer that program.
So essentially, that property owner does have the use of that land. It's not gone away from them.
Right. I mean, the way the rules are set up, the director made this point earlier, the rules do limit in some way the types of things that can go in there. So in my experience, I've only seen a couple of occasions where somebody was proposing to intrude upon the buffer, and we said, you know, I don't have a variance for you under our criteria. You need to move that 10 more feet this way, and you're good to go. But if they do need to intrude upon the buffer, most often there is a criteria that they can meet.
Thank you.
Number 9, Tom.
Yes, I had a
Tom, state your name and.
crimes from Coweta County, and I'm very familiar with our rules and regulations there. We have multiple buffers that get added in addition to the 25 that are apparently, one of them is because we're in the North Georgia Water Planning District. Does that fall under the EPD, or does that fall under another?
Well, so there are, let me answer that in two ways. First of all, the Erosion and Sedimentation Act provides the buffer that says you can't intrude upon this buffer, or if you are, you're going to need to get a variance. Mm-hmm. And EPD implements that variance program. There are other buffers for like watersheds that really are implemented by your local governments in terms of their ordinances as to what can be built where. And so that's not something that EPD implements.
Okay.
Okay, just a couple more slides from me. A couple of slides on sort of where the buffer would be measured from. And so here's just a couple of pictures, one of a perennial stream and one of an intermittent stream, where it's pretty easy to see where your vegetation ends and the stream begins. And so we would begin measuring the 25-foot buffer, or if it was a trout stream, the 50-foot buffer from that point. This question comes up periodically where you've got a larger, a slower moving stream that meanders. It's very common to have a pretty substantial sandbar on the interior of a curve. In that case, you would just continue to go up the sandbar until you found the point where the vegetation began, and that's the point of rested vegetation there. So it's a little hard to see exactly where the line would be from the picture, but the arrow gives you an idea of what you would do. You just go up the sandbar until you get to the point where the vegetation is established. These are examples of where EPD would say there is not a buffer. There's not a buffer because there is not rested vegetation due to shoreline stabilization projects. And so many of you are probably familiar with the bottom left picture is Columbus, the bottom right picture is Savannah. EPD doesn't regulate in any way what goes on next to those river walks where there's stabilization. And then the top picture is a common example of where shoreline stabilization has occurred. At the point where that needs to be installed for the first time, EPD would be involved as to whether or not it's necessary and appropriate to build that structure. But at the point where it's built, then EPD is going to say that there's no longer rested vegetation, and we would no longer enforce a buffer on the landward side of that structure. And then I mentioned as we were talking a little bit about wetlands, since it's going to be the primary issue in the Tired Creek case that I'm about to get into. It's a typical picture of a freshwater wetland. You can very easily see there as you transition from water to land, there is not a point of rested vegetation, and so that's the reason why EPD does not say that those waters are buffered under the Erosion and Sedimentation Act. Okay, wrapping up, this really became a very sort of front page issue a few years ago when Grady County desired to build a new lake in their county, and they were going to build a 960-acre fishing lake on Tired Creek, and so you'll commonly hear EPD, and I assume others, refer to this as the Tired Creek case. And so they did have to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers to build that dam and to cover up the wetlands. So there certainly was regulation of the impact of the wetlands. But under the Erosion and Sedimentation Act, EPD said that you did not need to, your variance, which we did grant a variance for impacts to the streams, we did not include in that variance the impacts to the wetlands. EPD issued that buffer variance in 2012, and then Environmental Group challenged that variance, arguing that EPD's variance was deficient because it did not consider the impact on the wetlands. So as you've heard me say this morning, not surprisingly, EPD's position was that wetlands did not require buffers because they lack rested vegetation and were therefore not subject to the variance request. And so if there has to be rested vegetation for there to be a buffer, if there's no rested vegetation, there's no buffer, completely consistent with the 2004 memo that you have before you and consistent with EPD's longstanding practice as it pertains to wetlands. That legal challenge eventually made it all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court. And at the Georgia Supreme Court, EPD prevailed with a 5-1 decision in 2015. And just to remind you, I've included at the bottom bullet of the slide, so really the language of the statute that was at issue was this phrase, there's a 25-foot buffer along the banks of all state waters as measured horizontally from the point of rested vegetation. So the court had to grapple with the comma after state waters followed by the phrase as measured. And so the last slide that I have, these three bullets are copied verbatim from the court's decision, and these are really the three principal findings that they made. And the whole majority decision is only about 6 pages, so it's a very easy read, and they do take a fairly complex issue and make it pretty easy to understand from a layman's perspective. But here are the 3 points that they made. Had the legislature placed a period after the word waters, so remember the phrase from the previous slide, rather than a comma, and had gone no further, then there would be no other conclusion but that buffers are established along the banks of all state waters, regardless of the existence of rested vegetation. I think that's a key point because if the legislature is going to consider changes to that provision, what the court says here, I think, is pretty relevant. That if you were to put a period after the word waters, then there's a buffer on all state waters, and you just want to consider what the impact of that would be. Second point, it's not what the legislature did by adding the phrase as measured horizontally from the point where vegetation has been rested. The assembly expressly defined how the buffer is established. Since the legislature offered no other method for the buffer to be established but for the measuring it horizontally from the point of rested vegetation, The buffer necessarily cannot be applied to state waters that are adjacent to banks without rested vegetation. No further interpretation or analysis is required. So that was fully consistent with the way EPD had been administering the program and the way that EPD continues to administer the program. I think that concludes my slides. I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you. And our first question, I'll go back to Mr. Reheis. Just state your name and refer us to the area you're talking about. Thank you.
Harold Reheis, I just wanted to make a comment on the question that Mr. Crimes had regarding additional buffers that have been set by the Metro North Georgia Water Planning District communities. The law is a state law that established the Metro North Georgia Water Planning District. Some of the planning activities that are done by the district have to be reviewed and approved by EPD. But the district has authority to establish policies and acceptable requirements by which all of the governments will abide that are inside those 15 counties that are in the district. One of those policies is about stream buffers, and the planning district established that the minimum of 25 feet that's in the state erosion sediment control law ought to be more within those 15 counties. And so they recommended an additional distance if and I forget if it's 25 additional feet or 50 additional feet. Jack, you may know. But those local governments are not required to adopt that exactly, but they can, they are required to do something equivalent in protection to the stream. So as a matter of practice, most all of those governments have simply extended their local buffers in accordance with the recommendations of the Metro North Georgia Water Planning Act. Okay.
Thank you. And our senator.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Said one of the things that when I look at, you started off originally talking about the trout streams, and I'm not sure, I believe there may be a minimum flow requirement in a trout stream in order to have that buffer requirement. Is there anything in the law that addresses a certain flow?
No, there isn't. There would need to be adequate flow to create rested vegetation.
Okay, but nothing as far as sustainability?
No, EPD defines those areas in the rules. So the area would be defined in the rules, and then there would have to be rested vegetation.
And my favorite thing that we do in the legislature is we always have exceptions and exemptions. And would you kind of touch on my favorite exemption, because I like to eat, is agriculture and what's going on with agriculture exemptions and buffer requirements and agricultural practices?
Well, the activity itself is exempt. So I think where they get into building a structure, then we would apply the buffer provisions for a structure that would be developed. But I mean, that activity is exempt, so it's exempt.
One of our committee members that couldn't be here today, his favorite question is always, okay, what's the difference between a farmer plowing down to the stream bank and that being exempt, and a builder, scraping in a driveway closer to a stream bank than's allowed in the buffer? Is there a difference between farm dirt and builder dirt? And I'll just let you address that one.
I might defer that back to the legislature, since they develop the exemptions. EPD implements the exemptions. We don't develop them.
That's why we're here today.
Okay, very good.
Our next question is number 27. State your name and then ask your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Representative Scott Holcomb. Are there any negative consequences other than the inverse of the bullets that you have listed on slide 2 for the lack of buffers?
If I'm understanding you correctly, you're asking if are there negatives to having buffers?
Other than just the inverse of what's on your bullets. In other words, what would the negative consequences be of the lack of stream buffers? This lists the positive benefits.
Off the top of my head, I can't. I mean, if you have something in mind, I'm not thinking of it.
Okay. And then if you turn to slide 13, which is the photo that you have, and I'm trying to understand all this, I think as all of us are, because of the lack of a period, this example, there's no buffer requirement at all, correct? Which is basically the question that we're tasked to figure out.
Is this a picture you're referring to?
13.
Wetlands.
Oh, thank you.
Freshwater Wetland.
There we
That
go.
one.
Yes, is the answer to that.
Okay.
There's not rested vegetation in that picture. There's no buffer.
So there's no legal requirement for a buffer whatsoever.
Under the Erosion and Sedimentation Act.
Okay.
Yes, under the Erosion and Sedimentation Act. As I mentioned, I mean, this was the key issue in the Tired Creek case.
Exactly.
They did get a permit from the Corps of Engineers to inundate those wetlands. So there was regulation of the wetlands in that regard, but EPD said there was no buffer under the Erosion and Sedimentation Act.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And number 3?
Yeah, Jack, thank you. Terrific presentation. I still am a little bit confused about the definition of rested vegetation. Could you provide some further guidance for me? Because I think in here it said anywhere where the stream flow has moved the vegetation. Is that
Right. So here's the definition from the statute, the very bottom of that slide. Movement of water that removes soil, debris, and vegetation, creating a clear demarcation between water flow and vegetative growth.
Okay.
And so you've got to have some velocity, some power of the water in order for those for that vegetation not to be able to establish itself, right? And then you can see that point of demarcation where the plants have not been able to establish themselves due to the flowing of the water.
so it doesn't require actual vegetation there? If there's no vegetation, it's been removed by the flow of the water, then that counts as rested vegetation. Is that the way you interpret that?
You're looking for the point of demarcation
Okay.
between the vegetation and where there's no longer vegetation due to the flowing of the water. So there should be vegetation in order to see where it's been rested. And I think that was really what I was pointing out with the sandbar illustration. If I can go back to it quickly. Right, you've got, and that's, if you can tell, that's the interior curve of a rather large stream. And so, you know, during probably where it commonly flows, you know, obviously there's no point of rested vegetation there at the water line, because when the water levels are higher, that flow of that river is strong enough to prevent anything from rooting in that area. And so you just go up the bank a little bit and find where the vegetation's been rested, where it can't establish itself. In the vast majority of cases, as in that picture, it's pretty easy to see.
Yeah.
Thank you. And to our committee members, this is a lot to take in. I've had several years to study this issue as a legislator, and so if you have some thoughts afterwards, we'll be collecting your questions and your thoughts and be using that as a basis for our next meeting. So you don't have to try and get it all out now. It's a lot to take in. So number 24.
Harold Reheis, I just wanted to make one clarifying comment perhaps to Representative Holcomb's question. The state law that we're talking about here and the decision by the Supreme Court of Georgia deals with whether or not there is a state buffer on a wetland. The fact that the decision was this 25-foot buffer doesn't apply to wetlands does not mean that there's no protection for wetlands. They are highly protected by the Federal Clean Water Act, and in specific, something called the 404 permit process, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, requires a federal permit if you're going to disturb wetlands or stream bottoms anywhere in America. And there was a very extensive federal permit process. There is an extensive federal permit process for disturbance of wetlands, and the process for a fishing lake or a reservoir like this is arduous and lengthy. And that particular permit was gotten for the Tired Creek Reservoir, and it took more than a decade to get it. So it wasn't something that just popped out. There was a lot of protection, and there remains a lot of protection for wetlands in federal law, just not that 25-foot buffer on state law. Sorry, Madam Chair. I'll try to.
No, thank you. This committee is going to define how it acts, and clarification is, is helpful along the way. And as much as I've heard this, I need to hear it again and again and again. So we really appreciate your presentation. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. Will you be around afterwards as well, too? Okay. Thank you very much. Our next presenter is John Welch with Harvest Manager Warehouser Company. And do we need to set up for your presentation? Okay. All right. Okay. We'll have someone check that with you. So in the meantime, while they're getting ready, there's a sign-up sheet in front of us at a table in the very front if you wish to speak, and we encourage you to do so. So go ahead, and you're not interrupting us if you come up to sign up that you want to speak. So just let you know to do that. And for our committee, we'll hear the presentation and then ask questions after, because I was just reminded that we've gone a little bit over our time schedule allotted here, but we'll get it done. We have the room until 1 o'clock, and appreciate all your questions. And if there are any comments now a panel wants to make, our committee, while we're waiting for the installation. I will do a little bit of filler here then. So the Natural Resources Committees, House and Senate, meet in the interim with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, and we delve into some of the specific issues in more of an academic setting to try and get our handle on the issues. And one of the questions we're always wondering is, well, what are the other states doing? What are our neighboring states doing? And one of the things we realized is that the state of Georgia is pretty much way out in front of its protecting of its water and its land. It's amazing when you look at that data, and maybe we can get it for you at some point to see how much of we're good stewards of our water. So as we have these debates, I also need to keep in mind that there's a big history of dealing with our issues, but it always changes, and so we always need to try and keep up with it. And Mr. Welch, good to go?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank both chairmen and members of the committee. It is my honor to speak today on behalf of the forestry community. My name is John Welch, and I'm a harvest manager with Warehouser Company. Much of my professional experience is specific to timber harvest planning and harvest management. This translates well to the discussion today regarding buffers, because water quality considerations and stream buffers are a component of almost every timber sale. The scope of this presentation is to provide an overview of forestry in Georgia, specific to stream buffers. I'll discuss best management practices for forestry. I'll also discuss how partnerships have formed within the forestry community to address water quality. My goals are to show you that forestry is dedicated to protecting water quality, and that existing practices and stream buffer definitions are proven, effective, and widely accepted. I'll start by providing a summary of Weyerhaeuser's operations. Weyerhaeuser is a publicly traded REIT based in Seattle, Washington. The company was founded in 1900 and currently owns 13 million acres of timberland within the United States. Weyerhaeuser operates both timberland and wood product manufacturing businesses. The company has operated in Georgia since 1966 and currently manages 767,000 acres of timberland. As shown on the map, the ownership is distributed across the state, and the primary business here in Georgia is growing, harvesting, and selling timber. When discussing ownership, Weyerhaeuser only represents a small piece of the forest land in Georgia. There are 24.8 million acres here in the state. This map shows the distribution by county. Counties shaded dark green have a higher percentage of forest land in them than the muted shaded colors. Unique to Georgia is the percentage of privately owned timberland. 22.2 of the 24.8 million acres in the state are in private ownership. Other states have similar forest resources, but what's unique to Georgia is the ownership structure. And some of those other states, large components of those resources are associated with public ownership, and they're not available for normal commercial use. The scale of this resource and the ownership structure are the foundation of Georgia's forestry sector. This sector consistently supports a significant component of the state's economy. In 2015, forestry was a $19.2 billion industry with a total economic impact of $32.2 billion. It ranks second in total employment with 133,000 jobs and provided $753 million in tax revenue. Aside from direct economic benefits, forestry plays an important role in protecting the state's water resources. A recent survey conducted by the Forestry Commission found that the public's primary issue related to Georgia's forests was water quality and quantity. The results of this survey were compiled into a strategy report where the Forestry Commission outlined specific goals, objectives, and performance measures to address this issue. These include best management practices for forestry. Best management practices for forestry, or BMPs, were first developed in 1981 in response to requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act. They have been revised several times and are currently available online at the Forestry Commission's website. BMPs are non-regulatory guidelines used to protect water quality during forest operations. The guidelines are both practical and effective. BMPs include all aspects of forest management, such as harvesting, site preparation, reforestation, stream crossings, streamside management zones or buffers, as well as roads. Stream buffers are just one component of this system, and this system works together. It requires a proactive approach, and each BMP does not necessarily function independent of itself, but rather they build on each other to protect water resources during forestry. Streamside management zones, or SMZs, are buffers adjacent to a water body. The primary function of an SMZ is to prevent sediment and other pollutants from reaching the water. Buffer width depends on slope and stream type, and width is measured along the ground from the stream bank. The table is from the BMP manual. You can see that buffer recommendations are provided for perennial, intermittent, and trout waters. Recommendations are also provided for 3 different slope categories. Steep slopes carry more risk of sedimentation into the adjoining water body, and they require a wider buffer. In practice, SMZs are established prior to harvest. Stream classification and buffer widths are determined by foresters. The buffers are then marked on the ground with either paint or flagging to set a physical boundary for the timber sale. Benefits of SMZs extend beyond sediment filtration, and that slide shows some of those. They protect the banks and stream channels during operations. They minimize woody debris from entering stream channels. They also stabilize water temperature, which benefits aquatic ecosystems. And the buffers also provide travel corridors and habitat for wildlife both on a local and landscape level. This picture shows SMZs that were left during a pine clear cut on fairly gradual slopes. You can see there were 3 distinct areas that were harvested with this timber sale. You can also see the trees left standing in the SMZ. These were left based on the recommendations in the Bmp manual. You can see the buffer follows the natural topography line and the buffer is continuous. Both are aspects of a properly executed SMZ. You can also see, or I hope you can see, there's a strip of vegetation that runs parallel to the SMZ. This area was included in the timber harvest, but excluded from site preparation. And it demonstrates that water quality protection doesn't necessarily stop just with the timber harvest, and that SMZs are also important aspects of all forestry operations. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that BMPs are non-regulatory. I'm going to revisit that statement and and describe the regulatory process that applies to forestry and water resources. While BMPs are non-regulatory, federal and state Clean Water Acts do apply. These laws apply to forestry, and violations of those statutes can invoke regulatory action. Forestry compliance is managed between the Forestry Commission and the Environmental Protection Division. As shown on this map, the state's divided into 4 different regions. Each region is assigned a water quality specialist from the Forestry Commission. These foresters provide BMP education to landowners, logging contractors, land managers, and wood buyers within their region. They also provide site-specific BMP advice, including stream classifications and buffer recommendations. They are responsible for reporting and resolving all water quality complaints and violations associated with forestry. If the Forestry Commission has a water quality violation, the case is then passed to the Environmental Protection Division. Enforcement requires corrective action and may involve fines. Both the Forestry Commission and Environmental Protection Division support BMPs and recognize them as the primary way to maintain compliance with federal and state clean water laws. Forest certification also plays an important role in BMPs. The Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI, is an independent certification standard that is accepted widely around the world. It is used by most timberland owners and primary mills in Georgia. Certification relies on third-party audits to verify compliance to certain standards. In practice, certification supports BMPs in 3 different ways. First, they are a program requirement for all member companies. These companies have to demonstrate that their operations meet or exceed BMPs during the independent third-party audits. The audits apply to both forest management and wood procurement. SFI also supports BMPs with the Master Timber Harvester Training Program. This is an SFI program requirement for suppliers that deliver wood to SFI mills. It's also a program requirement for contractors that are working on SFI timberlands. Since 1995, there have been 5,000 participants in the program. This is a 2-day workshop for foresters, wood buyers, logging contractors, site prep contractors, and it also has continuing education requirements. BMP training is included in the core class and all continuing education. The third way that SFI supports BMP implementation is through reporting. When the Forestry Commission reports a BMP violation, it is shared through SFI with all receiving mills. SFI member mills are required to take action with the supplier and may refuse wood deliveries. The Forestry Commission, Southeastern Wood Producers Association, Georgia Forestry Association, and the University of Georgia work together to help support SFI. This self-regulatory approach has been very effective in encouraging BMP implementation across the state. This graph shows BMP implementation rates in Georgia from 1991 through 2015. The data was collected by the Forestry Commission through their BMP monitoring program. The green bars represent overall BMP implementation for that reporting year. As you can see, the graph shows a positive trend for BMP implementation since the beginning of the program. The red line that's on the PowerPoint, I'm not sure if you have color slides, but there's a line across the top of the chart that shows the current regional BMP implementation rate for the entire southern region. And it shows that for the past 10 years, implementation rates in Georgia have been consistent with the current regional rate. This graph compares BMP implementation in Georgia to 9 other states across the nation. Aside from Georgia, all of the other states regulate BMPs through law. So they're a legal requirement of forestry. The laws vary by state, and some have other program requirements, but the primary scope in this slide is that they regulate BMPs through law. The red line correlates with Georgia's current implementation rate, or the gray line on your slides, and you can see, or I think the graph does a nice job demonstrating that additional regulation does not always correlate to a significant increase in BMP rates. There's over 25 years of BMP research that has been conducted throughout the South. Both effectiveness and implementation rates have been tested by universities, federal and state agencies. The table shown on this slide comes from a literature review of BMP research that was published in the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management. This is just one specific portion of the review that described SMZ research. I highlighted several key statements from the major conclusions, but the key takeaway is that when BMPs and SMZs are properly applied, they protect water quality in forest operations, and that's been proven through research. This table shows EPA data that was published by the Forest Service. It was done in a national report on sustainable forests. The EPA tracks sources of water quality impairments in a national database. These sources of impairment keep waters from meeting state or federal requirements. You can see, well, if you look, the sources of impairment are listed on the left. There's many listed, and I've got arrows next to the numbers associated with forestry. The EPA tracks this according to rivers and streams, as well as lakes, ponds, and reservoirs. And you can see in the data that forestry accounts for less impairment than any other source. I think it does a nice job of speaking to the success of the BMP program, forest certification, and the education programs throughout the state and the nation. This picture shows SMZ implementation on a track in Hancock County. This track is very representative of many others in the area. It has been in industrial forest ownership for over 50 years. It has rolling topography, variable stream types. There have been 2 clear-cut harvests on this property in the last 6 years. There's really 3 key points I wanted to share on this photograph. The first is, following the last 2 clear cuts, we measured 17.3 miles of SMZ on the property. You can see in the picture that there were no breakthroughs in the buffers during the harvest or the site preparation and reforestation that followed. The second point that I want to make is regarding the SMZ width. The SMZs measure between 25 and 125 feet wide on this property. The variable buffer widths are driven by stream type and slope according to the recommendations in the BMP guidelines. One point I want to make, though, is that there was no guidelines for an 125-foot buffer. If you remember, 100 feet was the largest category, or there was the largest buffer recommended in that guideline. And in some cases, as with this track, forest certification can supersede BMP guidance. That was not necessarily done for water quality considerations, but other landscape level considerations are made through forest certification, such as wildlife and aesthetics, and this demonstrates that in practice. Also of note, there are 119 acres of SMZ on the property. This is 20% of the land area on this track. This is land that has been removed from commercial timber production and shows a significant financial commitment to protect water quality on the track. This commitment becomes even more significant when you think beyond one track or any one individual owner. Forestry's commitment is extremely significant when you consider the landscape level decisions that are made to protect water quality across the state. In summary, I would just like to highlight 4 points from the presentation. First, when properly applied, BMPs are effective at protecting water quality. Secondly, Bmp implementation rates are high in Georgia and aligned with regional rates. The third point, water quality impairment levels from forestry are low, lower than any other source of impairment. The fourth, forestry is committed to water quality protection through investments on the landscape and education. To close, I ask that regardless of what decisions this committee makes on buffers, please do not make any changes that affect the BMP program or stream buffer definitions for forestry. This program is widely accepted and has been successful for over 30 years. Any changes to the program may have unintended consequences for forestry. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak on behalf of forestry. This ends my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Welch. We do have questions, and now is the time to ask questions. Chairman Ginn?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. If I go back to your slide where you have U.S. EPA sources of water quality impairment, and I look at that, you've got forestry as the lowest source of impairment. One of the things I was unsure of was when it's got natural listed, and natural is hard to make out with my bad vision, but it looks like about 4 or 5 times worse than forestry. Tell me, what do we call natural? And because forestry in my world is natural,
Sure.
But what does that mean? You have any idea?
I'd have to refer back to the EPA for a specific answer, but the way I would interpret that is natural disasters, natural events. We have landscape level events that occur across the nation, and hurricanes, fires, all have water quality impairments that are associated following those events, and I would assume that's what it's referring to. Those events can be fairly catastrophic when you, again, consider them from a landscape level approach, the amount of acres affected in a watershed at any one time, and the impacts that they may have on that watershed.
There might be one other explanation for natural impairment, and Jack Cap would be better to speak to this than I, but in EPD's list of impaired streams, they always list what they think the categories of the pollutant are that are causing problems, and often you'll see it's fecal coliform bacteria, but you can be in a watershed that's got nothing but forested lands, and you'll still see that fecal coliform bacteria from time to time. That would be natural. That would be from birds and animals that live there. And so that may be where EPA gets that. I don't know, just a possibility.
Thank you. And number 3?
Great job on the presentation. Really enjoyed that. And I think there's, from a wildlife standpoint, the timber industry's been a terrific partner, and we appreciate all the work that you do and your partners do across.
Well, thank you.
Just curious, when I looked at the slide number 15, and you said about 20% of that land has been taken out of timber production, does that landowner qualify or receive a conservation easement for that land that's been taken out?
Not in this particular case. That was
Okay.
just associated with normal forestry operations.
Do they, is that a possibility for
It
a
is.
person utilizing that? So you can get some, you do get some compensation, I guess.
consideration, that's
Some
correct.
consideration, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We'll be getting ready for Commissioner Riley's presentation. We have number 4 for a question. State your name, please.
Dale Green, great presentation, thank you for that. I would just ask you maybe to clarify the sediment that does come off of managed, off of timber harvest. Is it not true that the bulk of that sediment is not from the landscape that's harvested, but is actually from the roads that are used during the harvest operation?
That's correct.
Yeah, so that's a short-term sediment source just during that operation.
That's correct.
Thanks.
So I want to thank you for your presentation, and I hope I get this superlative title correctly, but the state of Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the nation. Is that
That's
correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And we thank you for your investment in Georgia and for making us the great state that we are, and all the metropolitan Atlanta areas, other areas that have trouble with non-attainment. Your trees help us get out of that mix, so we appreciate
Thank you
that
very
too. Thank you. Commissioner Riley?
Good morning, Madam Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'll be very brief. I do not have a PowerPoint, but I will speak very briefly on valuation of real property in the state of Georgia. Currently, Section 48.5 of the Official Code of Georgia provides that legislative and statutory guidance for the valuation of real property in the state. That is administered at a local level. We have 159 counties in the state of Georgia and 159 assessing entities that provide that valuation service uniquely within their jurisdictions. The Department of Revenue provides guidance and education to the members of local Board of Assessors and assessing staff. However, the final determination of value of property at that local level rests with the local chief appraiser and Board of Assessors. The department does not have statutory authority to override any value that is placed on property, but merely can provide guidance on how to determine that value. The property owners have the ability through a judicial, an appellate process to dispute a value that might be placed on their property, and can go through many levels to determine a true value on which taxes are to be assessed and paid. Any specific restrictions on property and its use are recorded at the local level and should be taken into determination by the assessing officials when settling on a final value for that property. And that really is the sum total of the information that I was hoping to provide today, but I'll be happy to stand for any questions.
I imagine you're going to have a few. So anyway, thank you for your presentation. And Chairman Ginn?
Commissioner, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for the job you do. As we always said, it's all about the money. One of the things that I've noticed in doing a little looking at other states, they're providing some relief for property taxes for property that may sit in a stream buffer or areas in that regard. And one of the things I want you to help to address for me, because the state got out of the property tax business. We historically collected $250,000 for the state on property taxes for decades. Said that has all gone away as of about 2 years ago.
Correct.
One of the things that for me, I'm curious, as a the legislature addresses a situation where we have a huge impact in our partners in local government, how would you go about trying to balance that fact of we set a buffer, we're taking away people's use of their property, and it's not necessarily impacting the state budget, but it drastically impacts the local government budget?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. Currently, there is no program in place that would provide relief to the local governments for any adjustment to value placed on real property. We do have a forest land protection grant program that I know you are aware of that provides relief to local governments for the preservation of forest land and covenants that provide for that. But that is the only program that we provide from the state level.
Do you know of any in your work in dealing with other states of any compensation that's done on the local level for these states that are trying to manage the stream buffers and how that would impact?
And I apologize, I have not done the research on that. I'd be happy to ask my team to look at that and bring back some information to the committee. But to my knowledge today, no, I do not know specifically.
Thank you. Any information that you could provide us, that would be terrific for our committee. And you know how this impacts we're all taxpayers one way or the other. Said those that own real property said they get to share theirs with the local governments in their community. Said but we all are working together to make Georgia a better place. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have a question for you, and this there is confusion, I guess, to the general public, and actually difficult to find clarification of the statute as to whether or not the limitations of buffers, the additional buffers placed on property by local government, city, county governments, does it or does it not? Is it included or not included in our statute? And we have asked around and got some clarification. So it does apply to our local governments as well. I have so many constituents who haven't a clue that this is something that they're entitled to check into or to understand. So is there a division within the Department of Revenue that advises our local assessors and a way for our citizens to be able to find out what's going on? So
thank you, Madam Chair. Truly, to determine any unique valuations at the local level, I would suggest you direct the constituents to their local assessing officials. The department, again, provides that education and guidance, but the ultimate determination of a value of a property rests at that local level. A property owner should inquire as to whether the assessors have taken into consideration any unique restrictions on a property, and should be encouraged to pursue that with their local government. If something is of concern to them, that any kind of remedy would rest at the local level.
Thank you. And I hope that's one of the challenges this committee can look at and maybe find a way for individuals to know that they are in fact entitled to this inquiry as to their property and the limitations placed on them by buffers. And to those out there who's saying it does not apply to local governments, it does apply to local governments. So it's federal, state, local government limitations on property. The property owner does have a right to redress on that issue.
Every property owner has in their right to challenge the determination of value on their property, and a very structured program that allows them to do so.
Thank you. Perhaps in the future we can have our local governments, their advisors, speak to this committee and help us see how it works. And my concern is that this is just something that slipped through the cracks, because every time I hear from somebody, they're saying, I didn't know I had that right. I didn't know I could challenge that. I didn't know. One of the latest things was the federal government and the floodplains and all the different changes to property within the floodplain. So I'm using this forum here to get the message out. I think our committee should be partially charged with much more clarity and a way for our citizens to simply find out what their rights are. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank
What
you very
this
much.
means is we gave you a brief presentation, but we'll be hitting you up for lots of questions and what to do next.
We
So,
look forward to assisting in any way we can.
all right, thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Any other questions? So then we move to our next presenter, Mitch Attaway, Executive Director of Soil and Water Conservation Commission.
Good morning, committee.
Morning.
Name is Ben Rusowitz. I'm the Urban Program Manager for the Georgia Soil and Water, and thanks for having the Georgia Soil and Water here today.
I'm sorry, I said, so I had the wrong name down.
Ben?
Ben?
Ben is good. My last name is really hard to say, so
Okay.
Ben works good.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about state waters and stream buffers. Really, this is just the basics. And part of understanding stream buffers is also understanding state waters at the same time. So with that, we have a short presentation to go through just on the basics of what we have out there today.
And can we get copies of that later for our committee?
Yes, I
Okay.
can
Okay.
provide it electronically. I have my computer, however you guys would like to get this presentation.
All right,
I
thank
can
you.
leave it on this computer as well, so it's already there.
Thank you.
So the definition of state waters, this is the definition straight from OCGA. One of the things that it does not entail is farm ponds. So that would be a property that is entirely contained upon one property that does not leave that property. Everybody else could read the definition and see all the different things that it does contain. But one example that I have is of the farm ponds. And we commonly see those with agriculture, with use for different irrigation and things like that. And going through part of state waters and knowing the buffers is knowing who determines them. Knowing who determines them is extremely important because in some cases you have the EPD making the state waters determinations, and in other cases you have the local issuing authority making the state waters determinations. This all depends if there's a certified local issuing authority that has a certified model ordinance from the city or county government by the EPD. Part of this is knowing what a buffer is, knowing what the state mandated buffer is, and just like the EPD has already said, that buffer is determined from the point of rested vegetation. So we're going to see this rested vegetation come up over and over again because this is where the buffer is determined from. So it's the state mandated buffer as measured horizontally from the point where vegetation has been rested by normal stream flow or wave action. So in layman's term, it's basically the movement of water that removes soil, debris, and vegetation, creating a clear demarcation between the water flow and the vegetative growth. So there's a little picture right there, but here's a little schematic that shows basically where the buffer would start from. And this would depend whether you have a trout stream or a warm water stream as to what the buffer would be if you had rested vegetation. Here's some pictures from the Oconee River. And looking at these pictures, you can see a clear demarcation where the buffer would start for this 25-foot buffer. And just like we were talking about before, local issuing authorities can have an additional buffer for state waters, being for the state buffer, as well as impervious surface setbacks. Here's another picture. Would there be a buffer required here? So if there's no rested vegetation, there would be no buffer. Here you have a stone wall that was built some time ago. There would be no rested vegetation, therefore there would be no buffer. There are several other instances where we run into in cases where there are no buffers as well. For example, you go along in the past, there might have been some streams that have been put in concrete. You go through and you find that they don't have any rested vegetation, therefore they wouldn't have a buffer. So what type of stream is present? Knowing the different types of streams and knowing what they're involved in helps you determine the different types of buffers. So there's 3 different types of streams out there: perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral. And understanding those helps you understand the buffer. So if there is rested vegetation on those, then there would be a buffer. If there's no rested vegetation, there wouldn't be a buffer. That depends whether it's a trout stream or a warm water stream as to what the buffer is. So in looking at it, a perennial stream, this is what everybody thinks about when they look at it every day. Maintains flow throughout the year, well-developed stream banks, presence of hydraulic soils, so basically that white soil that you see there. And this is the picture that probably everybody thinks about when they're thinking about a perennial stream, constantly flowing, having that 25 or 50-foot buffer depending on what it is. Then you get into where it starts sometimes getting a little bit more confusing to people as far as what an intermittent and what an ephemeral stream is. Basically the 2 in orange here are the difference that show the difference between what a perennial and what an intermittent stream is. So basically, an intermittent stream has base flow that is seasonally present, and it has presence of different aquatic insects in those streams. So here's an example of an intermittent stream. Part of the year, this stream will be flowing. The other part of the year, there will be no flow in the stream, so it could be almost dry. The other stream that's out there is an ephemeral stream. So the important part to this is it flows only in direct response to precipitation. If there is no flowing water within 48 hours of a rain event, the drainage feature is most probably ephemeral. So here's an example of what an ephemeral stream can look like. This is the before and the after rain event showing that. So if this is a warm water stream, it doesn't have a buffer because the buffer isn't required. If it's a trout stream, this would have a 50-foot buffer. There's a lot of common misconceptions when determining state waters. When we're talking to different people out there, a lot of people have misconceptions that whether it appears on a map. It is required that engineers go out to the site and make a state waters determination before they send in their plans, so that the state waters are appropriately determined out there on the site. If they have any questions, they then can go to the local ocean authority or the EPD to help get that determination made. So here's just an example of the two different buffers for non-trout and trout streams. Again, it's measured from the point of arrested vegetation, and it depends on the local ocean authority. You can go, for example, I've been on some pretty big projects where you go from one county having a 35-foot buffer to the next county dropping down to a 75-foot buffer, and it just depends where the line is between the county as far as where the buffer stops and starts. So you'd be going along seeing your 2 rows of type S silt fence at 35 feet. When you get to the next county, you see it at the 75-foot mark. It's just a matter of where the line's drawn. So in part of understanding trout streams, it's also understanding what they're made up of. So trout streams, pretty much what exactly you're thinking of. There's trout flowing in them. Secondary trout streams, there might not even be any trout in the water, but they're still considered part that is to be capable of supporting the trout. And that list can be found on the EPD website. So with stream buffers, there's also a lot of exemptions. I just put a couple of them here. There's many others that are regulated through the Georgia Erosion Sedimentation Act and the NPDES permits. Some of the most common ones are the stream buffer, the stream crossings for water and sewer lines. So as long as they're going within 25 degrees of perpendicular, basically not running parallel to the stream, they would be exempt if they're within 50 feet. Construction of public water system reservoirs, drainage structures, so those are those outlets that are maybe coming out from a stormwater detention pond or something of that nature. Roadway drainage structures, and another one that's there is construction of bulkheads and seawalls on Lake Oconee and Sinclair. There's a lot of other exemptions. I didn't want to bore you guys with every single one, but if you want more, I can make a full list of all the different exemptions that are out there. One of the things that has come up in the past is the coastal marshlands. The coastal marshlands basically a lot of times don't have rested vegetation. Basically through a lawsuit, they're now determined from the coastal marshland inland interface. So down there in the coastal areas, that is how they're determining buffers now. One of the things that we see when we get out on the sites is wetlands. A lot of times wetlands don't have buffers because they don't have rested vegetation. You can go up to the edge, but not into them. So we just provided some information here so that you guys can know exactly what a wetland is and what the definitions are of those and how they're basically incorporated out there. So there's a lot of different things that come into them, but one of the main things is you can see the different types of vegetation that are out there in those wetlands, as well as the different kind of soils that you're going to see when wetlands are found out there. So the wetlands delineators are looking for these different indicators that are found in these two different pictures. So there's a lot of different indicators as well. With that, this is the basic overview, and I know I went fast because you guys had some pretty long presentations already, and trying to stick to my 10 minutes. The Manual for Erosion and Sediment Control does have a lot of BMPs in it. It's basically a toolbox for engineers to use to select when they're doing a land disturbing site to help keep their site in compliance with clean water and the Clean Water Act.
Any questions from the committee? I know that they're going to want to have copies of your presentation, so we'll get our staff to get with you to do that. It was a great overview. I have a question as to, a question was posed to me that I will pose to you. If you own some property, say, just in one area, and in some areas you have rested vegetation, but other areas you don't, but it varies as to how far back in your property line it becomes irregular. Is there an argument to be made to remove the definition of rested vegetation and just go strictly to for example, a 25-foot buffer period, which brings a whole other set of debate, but that's the pressure that's out there right now on your legislators and on the community. So do you have any insight? We're not holding you to it, but to help people understand.
One of the things that I see is I go out there to a construction site. I have maybe a 1 acre construction site. That construction site, between it, maybe has an agricultural field that's being plowed.
Okay.
With, basically no BMPs except for the buffer that they're supposed to have. I'm having to tell that person that has that 1 acre site that they have to do all this stuff, and the person right next to them is plowing a 50 acre field. Sometimes it is extremely hard to tell people that, but these are the rules and regulations that we have. What I see on the plans is when there's rested vegetation, the buffer is shown. When there's no rested vegetation, they'll drop the buffer down to where it is. And a lot of times they want to get that in writing from the local issuing authority or the EPD so that they know what is going on, because things can change throughout a project as time goes on. Every situation is different. You're not going to run into the same situation on every single plan. You're always going to have different situations and different things that come up. Sometimes you might have a state water that pops up after you start digging, in which you have to, deal with. It might not have been there before, but due to ground pressure and different reasons, it might occur.
Thank you. And you're going to have a couple of questions now. Yeah. Sorry I did that to you. All right, number 3, state your name and then ask your question, please.
Mike Worley. Terrific presentation. You had a slide on there about exemptions. And we talked about forestry already and talked about their BMPs and the responsible way that they're taking care of the forestry. I know you said there's a whole list of exemptions, but for this particular legislation, so forestry is exempt in addition to what you saw in agriculture. Is that correct?
Agricultural is, except for agricultural buildings through the MPDS permits, they're regulated due to the fact that they're building multiple buildings in one, in which they would be but regulated under the general permit for use on a land disturbance site. So they would have to, in that provision, like let's say somebody's building 6 chicken houses, they would have to fall under the MPDS permit. Those are exempt from the local issuing authority because they're agriculture, but they would have to go through the EPD and those regulations through the MPDS permit. So that's the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. But just general agricultural, like plowing a field or something like that, would not be regulated.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you. And to our senator, if anybody wishes to speak, please come sign up, because we'll be taking the list up in a minute for public comment. The sheet is on the front table up here. Senator?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'm not sure, Ben, whether this question ought to toss to you or toss to Jack Cap or maybe Rick Dunn. But one of the things I appreciate the work the commission does, and you actually operate about 357 structures, dams in Georgia right now. And when we start looking at the benefits of those structures and how they improve water quality in Georgia, one of the things that I like to point out is they all act as sediment traps. Said every one of them is out there. Said wherever the sediment got into the stream, gives a place for the water to slow and drop that sediment out. Maybe you can address for me why it is so difficult for anybody to go through the permitting process to get a new structure built on a live stream in Georgia, but also throughout the country. And to me, the benefits of having those dams, and the what they provide to the citizens in acting as that way to catch that sediment. I'd like for you to address it, and then maybe I'll ask for Mr. Cap to come back?
Well, the Georgia Soil and Water, we have an exemption as long as we're working with the NRCS from the stream buffers to redo those dams. So those dams are watershed structures. They stop flooding from downstream. Their overall intent is to stop that flooding. But another part of it is that they do hold back some of the sediment that comes. It is one of the first places, you know, that it stops, like as anybody's pond might be if they have a dam. As far as me, a lot of the things that I see are maybe people working with the NRCS to build a pond, although that is kind of hard. In my spare time, I do have a farm. I did go through their agricultural best management practices. I did apply for that, but I didn't have enough animals to the fact that it would ever make it good enough for me to get a pond. So basically they wanted me to drill a well instead. So I don't know that 100% of the time the NRCS is going to give a pond to everybody. As far as permitting for recreation, there's a guidance document out there, but other than that, I think that falls back directly to EPD, so I think they might be the ones to better answer those kind of situations. But there's a specific process in which people have to follow for those recreational type ponds.
Did you want to address it?
If that's, if there are no more other questions, then, and right now I don't think we've got any other questions for you, Ben. So I'll ask Chief Cap to.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to address that. First, I'm going to caveat my response by saying I'm not sure that I can really answer the difficulty that the private landowner has in terms of an expense standpoint. Obviously, I think somebody who experienced that personally probably would be in a better position to say how difficult it was for them. But what I can do is give you some sort of sense of what they would be looking at. And obviously it is relevant to the size of the impoundment that they want to create, right? Obviously, if you go to a large impoundment like what we had in the presentation that I gave today, the Grady County Tired Creek situation, that's 960 acres. I had mentioned that certainly you have to get a Corps of Engineers permit to create that impoundment. Mr. Reheis was very apt to point out that that's a very lengthy process if you want to do that for a large impoundment. And so if you want to create a large impoundment, it is a very lengthy and arduous process. Typically, you would be talking about a municipality, though, that would be looking at that. Private landowner is probably looking to do something quite a bit smaller. The Army Corps of Engineers has general permits and general guidance for that kind of thing. If it's small enough to avoid regulation under the Safe Dams Act, there's no design requirements. So I wouldn't be quick to judge it as it being really, really onerous. Now, again, I'm not the private landowner that's trying to pay for it, so I might not be the best person to ask. But from my perspective, I don't see that as particularly onerous.
One of the things I guess I'll kick into the mix is stream mitigation credits and what happens in that regard. There's an additional cost for what's going on with it. If you could kind of address that for our audience.
Well, I mean that's going to be under the Corps of Engineers inundating the wetlands that may require some mitigation in that regard. Again, I don't know that I can really speak to the cost of it. You would have to get a variance. We described the variance process that EPD administers. You would have to get a variance for that impoundment because you're certainly going to intrude upon the buffer in order to build the impoundment. But again, I mean, we do those as a matter of routine. It's 60 to 90 days. We issue the permit and we move on. So again, I don't see that as particularly onerous process.
Thank you.
Any other comments from the committee? Thank y'all for your presentations. We can go back over the previous presentations as well now if there are any questions related to that. So this is our period of time for public speaking, and we have Jason Olseth. If you'll come forward, Jason. Tell us your name and who you represent.
Good morning. My name is Jason Olseth, and I'm the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. Appreciate the opportunity to provide a couple comments this morning. Little background. I've been at Riverkeeper for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I was with the Georgia Soil and Water Conservation Commission. So I was Ben from 2004 to 2007. And just a little bit of background on the agency. So you have EPD, you got Jack. They're the enforcement arm of the state. And then the commission is the education arm. So the commission has their erosion sedimentation control certification program, which was put into place by House Bill 285 in 2003. And the commission puts these classes out, and they teach all of the inspectors, including the EPD inspectors and the local issuing authorities, basically all of the laws for erosion control, and also how to make a state waters determination that requires a buffer. And back in 2005, 2006, I wrote most of those materials as they were being developed, and I taught a lot of those courses, including the courses that the EPD staff had taken to learn how to make a state waters determination so that they're universal across the state. And just want to give you a little example of my interpretation or my perspective of how this enforcement or how this determinations have kind of changed over time. So yesterday, I was at a site and was walking this stream, and this was in Douglas County. It was an intermittent stream, had flowing water yesterday flowing through it, very well-defined bank, frogs jumping around. There's aquatic life there. But there wasn't always a clear line of rested vegetation throughout that entire stream. There's a lot of leaf litter, lots of tree canopy, so there's lots of shade, and there wasn't a clear line of vegetation that had been rested by the stream flow flowing through it throughout that channel. There may have been a weed here and there or something like that, but then there was a bush on top of the stream bank. So when I was at the commission and teaching these classes, and somebody asked me, well, there's not always rested vegetation through here, where are we going to make that mark or that call? Because you have to measure the buffer from somewhere, right? We would point to that bush. Okay, that bush, that's your first piece of vegetation, so that's where we would measure it and take 25 feet out. But that bush isn't necessarily clearly rested, violently removed from that stream bank. It's just happens to be growing there, and that's the first piece of vegetation. So over the years, we've always just kind of looked at that bush or that tree in areas where there wasn't, this clear line of rested vegetation. But after the Tired Creek case, we saw from the EPD staff and some of the, we went on tours with some EPD staff looking at some water features, and I really saw, from my perspective, a clear change in how we were looking at this rested vegetation and how we were looking at the definition and interpreting this violent rested vegetation with roots hanging down. And rested vegetation works when it's there and it's clear, you can see it, you can measure it. But we have lots of waterways all across the state, North Georgia, South Georgia, Middle Georgia, where these are intermittent streams, perennial streams. They are very valuable, need to be protected, but they don't necessarily have this clear line of vegetation. And we need some type of mechanism to where when we don't see this clear rested vegetation, that we can measure it from someplace else, such as this bush or that tree or some other top of bank or ordinary high water mark. And I was happy to see in Jack's presentation that slide with the sandbar coming down. And my interpretation recently was that EPD was not putting a buffer on that area, talking to EPD folks. But I'm glad to see that EPD is interpreting the statute to where that does have a buffer because of the other bank. So there's just a lot of confusion out there, and we would be very open to discussing opportunities to help clarify and make sure that these waters that may not have a clear line of rested vegetation are protected.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? So this is the posture we're in now. We'll have some time before our next meeting. We will be looking at calendars and getting out some suggested dates. And if you would get your information back to us as early as you can, we'll do it through Nicole Chappelle, who's the administrator. And then the second thing, this is a lot to take in today, especially those of you who have not had to work in this area of law. So ask your questions. Just send us a list of questions or suggested people that you feel like we need to hear from. We've identified certain areas now, but as we delve further into the subject matter, I think it will help in other words, we need your opinion, we need your input to make this committee work. So if you will please take the time to do that when you get the communications from us, and just go ahead and start sending in your suggestions for other presenters to our committee. So we're a 17-member committee, and we are to determine the best course of action to address water protection while also maintaining private property rights. That's our challenge by the resolution. And I've been very patient going through this, and it's complicated, but it's always about the fair balance, which is what we're seeking. I'll turn this over to our chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. One of the things that to me, you know, we've got a court case that's out there that talks about rested vegetation and quote, the lack of buffer where you don't have that demarcation in it. One of the things that this past fall, and I want to brag on the Carl Vinson Institute, for a little training they do for some House members. I'm not sure all my senators need that, but we're glad to participate. Said there was an attorney there that presented some information about legislation in another state that dealt with determining stream buffers and where a stream actually starts based on a drainage area, the size of the watershed. To me, it was a very intriguing situation, because I'm going to tell you, one of our committee members who could not be here today, I've been on a site where he's been down in a ditch with folks from EPD and design professionals with the issuing authority, trying to say whether this, on his plan that he developed, whether there needed to be a demarcation of a buffer or not a buffer. And quite honestly, after watching them discuss it for about 20 or 30 minutes, said they couldn't reach a consensus on it. So I'm going to pick on Mr. Capps' statement that I think any reasonable person can be done. Well, I had three very reasonable people that couldn't make a decision, and these are true design professionals. And when I think about that, how's the public going to address that down the road? You know, these people make a living doing that. When I think about where we're at with the general public, we need to have a demarcation that works. So that discussion that we had last fall with the Carl Vinson Institute and where that goes on the demarcation of state waters that need a buffer based on a certain size drainage area, that's one of the things that I want to hear more about. And where we go in the future, it's really up to our committee members, because I know we've got several legislators that are on the committee, but y'all work with this day in and day out, and we're looking to hear from our committee members on what direction you want us to go in this study committee.
So thank you for coming today. And again, Nicole, if you'll raise your hand. Oh, she's not here right now. There she is in the back. So that we have been working administratively through Nicole, and then our committee analysts work with her. So if you get that information to us, we want your questions. We want your suggestions. If you know a particular way that might help us, you've seen all the information that's out there today. It's kind of a shotgun blast out there, but need to try and help it take some shape. So we stand adjourned. Thank y'all.